These stories came from a guy who's lived in Xinjiang his whole life. Over the years, he got to know a bunch of truckers and collected their wild and strange road stories. Story 1. The Empty Bus. I first heard this story from Old Ma, a veteran truck driver who regularly transported timber out of the Gongnais forest farm in southern Xinjiang. According to him, this unsettling encounter happened in the mid 1990s. Back then, Old Ma was hauling a load of timber from the forest farm to Heijing County. The roads were notoriously bad, most were covered in soft sand, and there were endless winding side paths that forced trucks to crawl along. To make sure he arrived by early morning, Old Ma would often drive through the night. That evening, as he left the forest farm, traffic was minimal, and after dark, it was practically non-existent. Surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Gobi Desert, Old Ma's truck was the only vehicle on the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Note, the Gobi Desert is a massive desert region spanning northern China and parts of Mongolia, characterized more by rocky plains than classic sand dunes. Around 2 in the morning, Old Ma noticed faint taillights ahead, flickering in the distance. He assumed it was another timber truck, so he sped up, intending to catch up and say hello. But when he drew closer, he realized it was actually a mid-sized bus. Puzzled, he had never heard of a night bus running this route. Old Ma dismissed it as a new service he simply hadn't heard about. He also noticed the license plate, Xin M, meaning it was registered to Bayangolin Mongol Autonomous Prefecture, often shortened to Bayangolin or Bayangoleng, the same region that administered the forest farm. Note, Bayangolin Mongol Autonomous Prefecture is a large administrative area in southern Xinjiang, encompassing deserts, mountains, and several counties. Old Ma followed the bus for about 10 minutes. Finding its speed too slow, he honked and signaled to overtake. The bus seemed to cooperate, easing to the side. As Old Ma pulled up level, he glanced into the pitch-black interior. No cabin lights. He shrugged, figuring the passengers were just asleep, then continued on his way. The road remained eerily empty after that, and Old Ma saw no other vehicles. But at around 3 in the morning, he again spotted a set of taillights up ahead, flickering just as before. Drawing closer, he read the license plate. Xin M. A chill ran down his spine. It was the same bus. Old Ma couldn't fathom how it had gotten back in front of him. There were no shortcuts he knew of on this route, and he had been driving these roads for years. Determined to find an explanation, he maneuvered alongside the bus once more and looked into the driver's seat. At first, it was too dim to see clearly. He edged closer, honked again, and stared hard. There was no one behind the wheel. Fear coursed through Old Ma, and he stomped on the gas, speeding past until the bus was well out of sight. When it finally disappeared from his mirrors, he exhaled in relief, still trembling from the encounter. Like many long-haul drivers, Old Ma held certain superstitions, and this incident only strengthened them. Unnerved and convinced it was unwise to keep going, he turned down a side road and spent the remainder of the night in a nearby village. Looking back on the experience, Old Ma realized he couldn't recall the bus's full license plate, only that it started with Xin M. From that day on, he swore off night drives on that route. Even now, the very memory of that driverless bus sends chills down his spine. Story 2. The Vanishing Noodle Shop. This eerie account comes from a veteran trucker named Wang, who has been driving for over 2 decades. He claims this incident happened in 2000, while he was transporting a shipment of clothing from Urumqi to Aksu. Urumqi is the capital of Xinjiang in northwestern China, known for its bustling trade routes, while Aksu lies far to the southwest, separated by expansive deserts and rugged terrain. Traveling between these two cities often involves crossing stretches of the Gobi Desert, a vast, mostly rocky wasteland that extends across parts of northern China and Mongolia. With urgent orders from his boss, Wang had little choice but to drive overnight. Unfortunately, mechanical trouble struck halfway, and by the time he managed to repair his truck, it was already 11 p.m. Starving, he decided to push on toward Xinyuan, another county on the way to Aksu, hoping to find something to eat. After about half an hour on the dark, empty road, he noticed a faint light flickering by the roadside, which was odd in such a desolate stretch of wilderness. When Wang pulled closer, he could just make out the words Hui Banmian King on a dimly lit sign. The Hui people are a Muslim ethnic group in China, well known for their halal cuisine, especially noodles. The tiny eatery stood all by itself against the dark backdrop of the desert and distant mountains. Although he found it strange for a restaurant to be open so late, Wang's hunger overruled his curiosity, so he parked and went inside. A single yellowish bulb cast a weak glow over the cramped interior. There were no other customers. A man in his 50s, presumably Huai, welcomed Wang with a warm smile and asked what he'd like. Relieved to see a friendly face, Wang ordered a plate of stir-fried beef noodles. Settling down at one of the worn tables, he noticed that the walls displayed Islamic-inspired decorations, including a tattered calendar from 1985 still hanging there, 15 years out of date. In just a couple of minutes, the noodles were ready. Wang, famished, ate heartily, while the old man quietly looked on. Between bites, Wang asked how he managed to keep a restaurant in such a remote spot, but the man only mumbled something about having done so for a long time. Pressed about the late hours, he chuckled awkwardly and mentioned it was simply his normal routine. Concluding that the proprietor was not much of a talker, Wang finished his meal without further questions. When Wang asked for the check, the man replied, 5 yuan. Surprised by the low price, he handed over one of the newer 5 yuan bills. The old man inspected it at length, as if unfamiliar with the design, before finally accepting. Back at his truck, Wang noticed the man waving goodbye from the doorway. Wang waved back and drove off, catching a glimpse of the same waving silhouette in his rearview mirror, even 100 meters down the road. He shrugged it off, thinking that he'd discovered a convenient little place with tasty, cheap food. A week later, driving the same route around midday, Wang decided to stop at the shop again. Yet when he reached what he was sure was the exact location, there was no sign of any building, not even a foundation. Growing uneasy, he circled back more than once, determined to find it. Still nothing. As he continued searching, Wang noticed a stretch of broken wall by the roadside, somehow familiar. Getting out of his truck, he realized it matched the outline of the very eatery he'd visited days earlier. But the wall looked so ancient and weathered that it must have been in ruins for many years, blending into the gobi around it. Stunned, Wang rushed back to his cab and left in a hurry, chilled by the thought that he'd eaten at a place that no longer existed. Even after all these years, Wang remembers that night as if it were yesterday. Since then, he's never stopped at a roadside noodle shop again. Just thinking about it, he admits, still leaves him with a sense of dread. Story 3. Where did my friend go? This account was passed down by Xiao Lu, a long-distance bus driver, and originally happened to his father, Old Lu, when he served as a military truck driver in Kashgar, Kashi, an ancient city in southwestern Xinjiang. At the time, the incident caused quite a stir among the troops. In 1970, Old Liu, then a young soldier, was ordered to deliver food supplies to the border checkpoint at Hangqilafu, a remote outpost near the Pamir Mountains. Though it was only about 400 kilometers from Kashgar, the roads back then were rough. Traveling overnight could take 2 full days, so Old Liu was assigned a companion, Xiao Deng, to share the driving. Their journey started smoothly. By nightfall, they refueled in Shufu County, a rural area near Kashgar, and continued in the dark. Around 1 a.m., Old Liu felt the need to stop, pulling the truck to the roadside of the Gobi Desert, a vast, mostly rocky desert in northern China. After he finished, Xiao Deng hopped out too. He had a more urgent call of nature. Old Liu pointed out a large rock nearby, and Xiao Deng hurried behind it. Old Liu climbed back into the truck, lit a cigarette, and waited. 20 minutes passed with no sign of Xiao Deng. Growing uneasy, Old Liu got out and called his name, but heard only silence. Moving closer to the rock, he called again, and still nothing. Alarmed, he rushed around to the other side. There was no trace of his friend, not even footprints. A chill crept over him. It was October, and the wind howled across the barren landscape. In this desolate region, there were neither wild animals nor places to hide. Frantic, Old Liu spent an hour searching by flashlight, but his batteries eventually died. Thirsty and exhausted, he gave up and decided to push on to Tashkurgan, a small town on the high plateau, to report Xiao Deng's disappearance. Upon arrival, old Liu leaped from the truck, shouting at the soldiers on duty, "I need to see a commanding officer. My friend has vanished." The news shot up the chain of command, and a company of troops was dispatched to the site where Xiao Deng had last been seen. They spent 3 days searching but found no clues, no footprints, and no body. The area was just empty desert, no quicksand, no sinkholes. High-ranking officers deemed the disappearance too strange to explain, ordering it kept secret to avoid alarming other soldiers. Xiao Deng's family was later informed he had been lost in a truck accident. As for old Liu, he became the main suspect at first, even spending 2 months in prison before eventually being cleared. Nevertheless, he was inexplicably discharged and spent the following years driving long-haul trucks. In 1980, he passed away in poor spirits, still tormented by the memory of losing his friend without a trace. According to his son Xiao Liu, once old Liu began driving long-haul routes as a civilian, he refused ever again to relieve himself by the roadside, going so far as to use a container in the cab. Even on his deathbed, he was reportedly murmuring Xiao Deng's name, haunted to the very end by the unanswered question, where did his friend go? Story 4. The Village. I've heard this story from multiple drivers, so it must be quite well known. It all began with Xiao Li, a long-haul taxi driver from Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang in northwestern China, who in the summer of 1996 took several passengers to Turpan, a city famous for its scorching heat in eastern Xinjiang. His plan was to pick up more passengers for the return trip, but no one needed a ride that afternoon. Not wanting to drive after dark, Xiao Li decided to head back to Urumqi. The journey from Turpan to Urumqi usually took over 4 hours at the time. There was no expressway yet. About an hour in, Xiao Li neared the 100-mile wind zone, an area near Turpan notorious for year-round strong winds, sometimes reaching force 10 in spring and summer. Although the wind wasn't extreme that day, a thick cloud of dust and sand filled the air, forcing him to switch on his headlights even though it was still daylight. Visibility was poor, but Xiao Li had driven this route many times and knew it by heart. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, as his lightweight sedan could easily be overturned by a sudden gust. After roughly half an hour, he saw a few buildings in the distance off to the left, with a narrow dirt track leading from the highway toward them. Hoping to take shelter from the sandstorm, he veered onto the side path. Yet despite appearing close, it took him another half hour to reach them. Upon arrival, he realized that there weren't just a few buildings, there were dozens, forming an entire village. This surprised him. He had driven in these parts for years and never heard of a village here. The place seemed deserted. All doors and windows were firmly closed, and as he drove around, he saw no one at all. The houses looked old and were built from mud bricks, a traditional construction material in rural Xinjiang made of compressed earth, rarely used nowadays. Oddly, the door handles showed no rust, and one courtyard even contained a nearly new tractor. Yet there were no lights, no people, not even a stray dog. The only sound was the relentless wind, and nightfall was approaching. Realizing he couldn't safely continue in that dust storm, Xiao Li thought about spending the night there. However, every door he knocked on went unanswered. With dusk deepening and his nerves fraying, he found the total silence and darkness of the village terrifying. There wasn't even a single lantern or bulb glowing anywhere. Panic rising, he bolted back to his car, started the engine, and fled, preferring to brave the storm rather than stay another moment in that ghostly place. Finally, he regained the main highway. Glancing back, the village had already dissolved into the swirling dust and gathering night. Heart-pounding, he drove another half hour, and almost as suddenly, the dust storm cleared. Overhead, a sky full of stars reemerged, and Xiao Li let out a sigh of relief, wondering if it had all been a dream. He arrived safely in Urumqi later that evening. The next day, on another trip to Turpan, he kept his eyes peeled in that same Gobi Desert, a vast desert region in northern China and Mongolia, typically gravelly rather than sandy, area for any sign of that narrow path or the mysterious village. Yet all he saw was the endless expanse of barren land. There was no trace of the route he'd taken or the village he'd visited just the day before. Story 5. The Strange Beast. This is one of the eeriest tales I've ever heard. It comes from Chen, who once served as an army truck driver in Yecheng, a county in southwestern Xinjiang, near the Karakoram Range. His unit's primary task was to transport critical supplies from a base to the Shenxianwan Outpost, a Kunlun Mountains border station at an altitude of around 4,500 meters, often called the highest outpost in the world. Chen left the service years ago and became a successful businessman, but during a drinking session, he recounted this chilling experience from 1989. That winter, Chen's unit received orders to deliver one final batch of provisions to the outpost before mountain passes were sealed off by heavy snow. Unfortunately, Chen was assigned to drive at the very end of the convoy, a risky position on treacherous mountain roads. Along with his co-driver, Li, he set out on the journey. The weather in the Karakoram, a high mountain range with severe conditions, was brutal. At lower elevations, fierce winds whipped clouds of gravel through the air, turning the sky a dusty yellow. Higher up, gusts carried endless snowflakes, transforming the landscape into a blinding white. Over 2 days, the convoy crawled forward until they reached about 3,500 meters above sea level. By then, the cold had worsened, and the roads were covered with an ever-deepening layer of snow. Suddenly, a monstrous gale sprang up, far stronger than before, hurling snow in all directions and obliterating visibility. Chen had no choice but to pull over. An hour later, the wind subsided enough that he and Li could step out and clear the snow from the road. Midway through shoveling, a thick fog rolled in. Anxious not to lose more time, they climbed back into the truck, ready to continue. Then, Chen spotted a figure in the fog, lumbering toward them. His first thought was that a fellow soldier had come looking for them, and he felt a surge of relief. But as he moved closer, within 7 or 8 meters, he realized something was off. The shape stood over 2 meters tall, with long swinging arms, more ape-like than human. Puzzled, since no primates are found in these mountains, Chen watched in alarm as it broke into a faster stride, emitting low, growling sounds. Terrified, Chen sprinted back to the truck. The creature's size slowed it down, and Chen managed to climb inside and slam the door. But in the freezing temperatures, the engine wouldn't restart. To make matters worse, the creature hauled itself onto the driver's side step and grabbed the door handle, trying to force it open. Chen quickly locked it from the inside. Undeterred, the beast began smashing its head against the window. And that was when Chen saw something he says he'll never forget. It appeared to be wearing a human face, like a small, distorted mask stretched across its own massive head. The sight was grotesque and utterly horrifying. Thinking fast, Li grabbed their snow shovel from behind the seat and handed it to Chen. Drawing on every ounce of strength from his military training, Chen rolled the window down just enough to swing the shovel, striking the creature and knocking it off the truck with a furious howl. Miraculously, at that moment, the engine finally turned over. Chen hit the gas, speeding away through the fog. Heart-pounding, he and Li kept glancing back to ensure the thing wasn't pursuing them. By sheer luck, they managed to reconnect with the convoy before nightfall, completing their mission without further incident. But word of their encounter spread through the trucking unit in Yecheng. The idea of a monster lurking in the depths of the Kunlun Mountains, one of Asia's longest mountain chains spanning western China, was already alarming, but one wearing a human face was almost too disturbing to fathom. Where had such a creature come from? Whose face was it wearing, and why? Not long afterward, Chen, who served as a volunteer soldier, filed for discharge. He started a business and eventually became quite wealthy. As for Li, tragedy struck the following year. He drove off a mountain road during another supply run, and neither his body nor the wreckage could be retrieved from the high-altitude ravine. Chen confides that even now, he sometimes dreams about that ghastly face, a warped, uncanny human visage stretched over something far from human, and wakes up in a cold sweat, haunted by that memory in the bitter cold of the mountains. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel, Spaz Backwood, and join the adventure. Story 6. A Hidden Utopia. Those who know a bit about Xinjiang, a vast region in northwestern China, are likely aware that its northern area is known for lush scenery, grasslands, forests, and lakes, with a relatively milder climate. In contrast, its southern area is far harsher, marked by barren mountains, desert sands, and the expansive Gobi, a rocky desert region in parts of northern and northwestern China. Yet today's story centers on an astonishing claim that somewhere deep in the scorching southern desert lies a green oasis, lush with water and grass, and inhabited by Mongolian families. The person who insists this is true is Jiang, our protagonist. It was 1993 when Jiang worked as a driver for a certain government bureau in Ruoxiang County, a remote county in southeastern Xinjiang near the southern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. Located within Bayangolin Prefecture, an autonomous prefecture in central Xinjiang at the southern rim of the Taklamakan Desert, one of the world's largest shifting sand deserts, Ruoxiang was, and still is, extremely sparsely populated, with fewer than 80,000 residents despite its enormous size, roughly equivalent to 5 times the area of Zhejiang province. Virtually all of this vast territory is composed of barren mountains, deserts, and rocky wastelands. One summer day in 1993, Jiang drove one of his bureau's officials to Korla, the capital of Bayangolin, so the official could catch a train to Urumqi for a meeting. At the time, the Desert Highway, a road crossing the Taklamakan Desert, was still under construction, meaning the trip from Ruoxiang to Korla took at least 2 days. After dropping off his passenger and resting for another day, Jiang began his return journey. On the second afternoon, close to Ruoxiang, the main road was suddenly blocked by a construction crew. A landslide had collapsed the surrounding mountainsides, making the highway impassable. The only option was a so-called side road, which was really just a pair of wheel ruts, faint tracks left by passing vehicles, carved out by a heavy truck through a steep, rocky valley. Jiang's ordinary Santana sedan handled paved roads well enough, but this uneven detour proved treacherous. He crawled forward at a snail's pace, wary of flipping over on rough terrain. Nearly 2 hours passed with no sign of the main road. Anxious, Jiang stopped the car, leaned out the window, and realized with alarm that the ruts he had been following had vanished entirely. In their place were only his own fresh tire marks. Convinced he had veered off course, Jiang retraced his route. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't locate the original tracks. An experienced driver with plenty of local knowledge, he was certain he'd followed the correct path. Yet the road simply didn't exist anymore. As dusk fell, Jiang reluctantly admitted he was lost. He had run out of water, and mobile phones were still rare in 1993, making rescue impossible. He needed to find a way out before night fully descended. Worn out and growing desperate, Jiang spotted a narrow path winding downhill along the mountain's side, little more than a hidden fissure between 2 slopes. Where there's a path, there's hope. He maneuvered the sedan into the crevice, which was just wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass in tight quarters. For an hour, Jiang descended steadily in pitch-black darkness, sheer walls towering on both sides. His nerves were on edge, but he clung to the hope that the path would eventually lead him to people. Oddly enough, it never leveled out. Instead, it plunged ever deeper into what appeared to be a basin, a low-lying area surrounded by higher ground. Jiang had never heard of such a place in Ruoxiang, but he had no choice but to keep going. At last, the slope eased, and Jiang felt the ground flatten beneath his tires. When he stepped out of the car, he was astonished to find soft grass underfoot and dense pine trees all around. How could a thriving pine forest exist in this famously arid region? Intrigued, Jiang ventured among the trees, searching for any sign of human life. Eventually, he spotted a faint glow in the distance. Approaching cautiously, he discovered a yurt, a traditional round tent used by nomadic peoples, particularly Mongolians. An elderly Mongolian woman answered his knock. Though language barriers prevented fluent conversation, gestures sufficed to explain his predicament. She kindly ushered him inside and offered a steaming bowl of tea. The interior was spare, lit by an ancient coal oil lamp, with a portrait of Genghis Khan, the 12th century founder of the Mongol Empire, displayed prominently. From what he could tell, the woman lived there alone. She gestured for Jiang to stay the night in her yurt, pointing to herself, then outside, making a sleeping motion to show she'd find somewhere else to sleep so he could rest undisturbed. Deeply touched by her hospitality, Jiang drank several bowls of tea, and despite having no dinner, fell sound asleep in utter exhaustion. At dawn, he was dazzled by the scenery surrounding him. He stood in a lush mountain valley blanketed with grass and scattered pine forests, as if in a hidden paradise. A few other yurts speckled the meadow in the distance. Sheep grazed on distant slopes, while Mongolian herders on horseback rode away into the hills. Soon, the elderly woman returned, bringing him milk tea and flatbread, which he devoured gratefully. Revitalized, Zhang tried to inquire about how to exit this remote valley. The old woman shook her head. A few other locals nearby also seemed unable to help. None appeared to know a route beyond their secluded domain. Perhaps they rarely, if ever, ventured beyond it. Still, Zhang had to press on. Thanking her, he refilled his canteen, returned to his car, and set off back up the steep track he had driven down the night before. Going uphill was far more demanding, yet daylight made it easier to navigate. Before long, he rediscovered the faint detour tracks. This time, he had no trouble following them all the way to the main road. Once safely back in Ruoqiang, Zhang recounted his tale, describing the astonishingly green valley hidden in the heart of a dry, desolate region. Few believed him. How could such a place exist in a county notorious for its unforgiving climate and scant rainfall? Undeterred, Zhang revisited the location where he had become lost, determined to re-find that mysterious downhill path. Yet no matter how hard he looked, the secret opening was gone. It was as if the valley had vanished. To this day, Zhang firmly believes in that oasis, a hidden jewel nestled among the barren mountains of southern Xinjiang. He remains convinced that somewhere beyond the desert's shifting sands and harsh, rocky slopes, there lies a secret haven of greenery, sheltered from the rest of the world. An unspoiled paradise that continues, unseen and unchanged, beneath the boundless skies. Story 7. The Mysterious Elder. This tale was shared during a casual drinking session by an experienced driver named Zhao, who spent his career driving for an exploration team in southern Xinjiang. Zhao retired in his 50s, leaving behind decades of memories from his travels through some of the harshest terrains in China. The incident happened in 1992, when Zhao's exploration team decided to conduct a comprehensive geological survey of the Lop Nur region, a former salt lake that dried up into a barren, uninhabitable desert area in Xinjiang. By then, Lop Nur had completely dried out, leaving it as a desolate wasteland where not even a blade of grass could survive. The team comprised 7 members and 2 Beijing Jeeps, rugged off-road vehicles common at the time, preceding more advanced models like Land Rovers or Toyota Land Cruisers. Zhao was the driver of one of these vehicles. The expedition begins. The survey went smoothly. The team spent 3 days in the heart of Lop Nur collecting valuable geological data. However, on their way back, disaster struck. The other driver swerved to avoid a large rock on the Gobi terrain, a rocky desert region, and flipped the Jeep. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, but the vehicle was completely totaled. Zhao's Jeep was already fully loaded with equipment and passengers, leaving no room for the 3 team members from the wrecked vehicle. Acting decisively, the team leader stayed behind with the stranded group, while Zhao, accompanied by 2 teammates, set out for the nearest county to get help. To lighten the load, they unloaded some equipment and left enough food and water for the group to manage until their return. An unlikely encounter. Driving through Lop Nur's vast emptiness takes a toll on even the most experienced. 2 hours into their journey, Zhao spotted something shocking, a human figure in the distance. In this uninhabitable wilderness, how could anyone be there? The figure stood directly in their path, and curiosity prompted Zhao to accelerate toward it. As they approached, the figure became clearer. It was an elderly man, walking briskly and seemingly untroubled by the harsh environment. Although time was of the essence, Zhao couldn't just leave him. Stopping the Jeep, he called out, "Comrade, what are you doing here all alone?" The old man approached the vehicle, calm and unhurried. "I'm part of a survey team," he replied. "I got lost while looking for water." Feeling sorry for him, Zhao offered a ride to the county. The old man didn't seem relieved or surprised, simply nodding and saying, "All right." The 2 other team members made room for the elderly man, who climbed into the Jeep. He had a scholarly air about him, wearing glasses that lent him a bookish appearance. As they drove, Zhao asked him where he was from. "Shanghai," the man replied succinctly. Zhao followed up, asking what had brought him to this inhospitable region. The man, not much of a talker, gave a brief answer: research. Thinking the man might be exhausted, Zhao didn't press further. The passengers offered him water, which he sipped politely, but without any visible sign of thirst. To everyone in the jeep, he didn't behave like someone who had been lost in a hostile desert. Instead, he seemed more like a tourist casually hitching a ride. The vanishing hours later, as night approached, Zhao and his teammates stopped to relieve themselves. In the desert, even urine is precious. It can be used as a last resort for survival. Carefully collecting it in plastic bottles, the three men took their time before heading back to the jeep. One of the team members suddenly exclaimed, "The old man is gone!" Startled, Zhao rushed back to the vehicle. Sure enough, the elderly passenger had vanished without a trace. The surrounding area was a vast, open expanse of rocky desert. No trees, no hills, nowhere to hide. It was as if the man had evaporated into thin air. The three searched frantically, calling out into the desolate landscape, but the old man was nowhere to be found. Puzzled and uneasy, Zhao decided they couldn't afford to delay further. Their stranded teammates were depending on them for rescue. With heavy hearts and no answers, they resumed their journey, back to safety. By early morning, Zhao and his group reached the county, secured another jeep, and drove back to Lop Nur. They arrived at the site by midday to retrieve the stranded team members. With everyone safe, the two jeeps completed their journey out of the desert, marking the end of their mission. On the drive back, Zhao recounted the bizarre encounter with the disappearing old man to the team leader, who was equally baffled. The leader promised to report the incident to higher authorities. The unsolved mystery. Despite Zhao's repeated attempts to follow up, the matter went unresolved. At the time, southern Xinjiang was grappling with instability, and the authorities were too preoccupied to investigate what seemed like a supernatural tale. 2 years later, Zhao stumbled upon a book describing the disappearance of a prominent scientist in the 1980s during a research expedition in Lop Nur. His mind reeled as he realized the elderly man bore a striking resemblance to the missing scientist. Could it have been the same person? But how could someone survive in the desert for nearly a decade? The thought haunted Zhao. If the old man was indeed the missing scientist, how had he managed to appear and vanish so mysteriously? Was he a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely? Zhao never found the answers. To this day, Zhao remains troubled by the memory. He often wonders if he'll ever uncover the truth, but deep down, he suspects that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. Here is some background about the mysterious elderly man Zhao might have encountered. On June 17, 1980, the renowned scientist Peng Jiamu led a research expedition in the Lop Nur region of Xinjiang. Due to a shortage of supplies, he ventured out alone in search of water, but never returned. Despite extensive search efforts by his team and rescue parties, only his footprints and personal belongings were found. His body was never recovered. Peng Jiamu's disappearance has sparked widespread speculation over the years. Some believe he succumbed to the harsh environment or was trapped in quicksand. Others have entertained more outlandish theories, linking his fate to extraterrestrial encounters or secret military experiments. Despite repeated search efforts, the mystery of Peng Jiamu's vanishing remains one of the most enduring unsolved enigmas in China's exploration history. Story 8. The Vanished Herdsman. This story is similar to the sixth one, but it comes from a friend named Sun, who has spent years trading wool in the Bayan Bulak grassland, a vast alpine meadow in southern Xinjiang. His work involved driving deep into the grasslands to purchase wool directly from Mongolian herders, then reselling it to larger distributors. This line of work, commonly called secondary trading, allowed him to negotiate low prices and make a tidy profit every year. The journey into the grasslands. In October 2004, just before the mountains closed for the winter, Sun set out on his final wool collecting trip of the season. The chill of autumn had already settled over Bayan Bulak. Driving his trusty second-hand Beijing 212 Jeep, a rugged off-road vehicle well suited for grassland terrain, Sun made his way from one herding point to another. A herding point refers to a location where nomadic Mongolian herders settle temporarily to graze their livestock. While many Mongolian families have transitioned to living in villages or towns, some still maintain their traditional lifestyle, moving with their animals to areas with abundant grass and water. These spots naturally form herding points, but they are small, typically housing no more than 40 to 50 people to avoid overgrazing and conflicts over land. A promising grassland, finding herding points was always a challenge, as they moved with the availability of resources. However, Sun had grown up in Bayan Bulak's largest settlement and knew the grasslands well. He had a keen sense of where the best grazing areas might be. Over 2 days, Sun visited several herding points, but collected only a modest amount of wool. The areas he visited didn't have particularly lush grass, so the herds, and thus the wool, were limited. Determined to find a better haul, he drove deeper into the grasslands. By midday, the grass grew noticeably greener and thicker. Sun's spirits lifted. Surely, this area would host a large herding point with flocks of sheep and plenty of wool. An hour later, as evening approached, Sun grew uneasy. Despite the promising grass, there were no signs of sheep or livestock along the way. He wondered if herders hadn't yet reached this area, but then he saw the faint outlines of yurts, traditional round tents used by nomadic herders, in the distance, perched on a hillside. Relieved, Sun drove toward the settlement. However, as he got closer, his excitement turned to confusion. The yurts seemed eerily deserted. Normally, herders would return to their yurts by evening, and smoke would rise from their chimneys as dinner was prepared. But there was no smoke, no barking dogs, a common feature of herding settlements, and no sound at all. The silence was unsettling. The empty settlement. When Sun reached the yurts, he called out loudly, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But received no reply. He peeked into one of the yurts and found it tidy and well-maintained, with clean bedding, a small tea table, and a portrait of Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, hung opposite the entrance. On the table was a teapot, and when Sun touched it, the water inside was still warm. Outside, clothes were hung to dry, still damp as if they had just been washed. Everything indicated the herders had been there recently, but where were they now? Sun checked several other yurts. They were all the same, empty, silent, and devoid of life. He even found a hunting rifle, something herders rarely left behind, as it was vital for protecting their livestock from predators. Strangely, the rifle was loaded, an unusual and dangerous choice unless there was an immediate threat. Sun's unease deepened. As night fell, the deserted herding point grew increasingly eerie. Clinging to a sliver of hope, Sun waited in his jeep, thinking the herders might return with their flocks. He watched the yurts, expecting to see families coming back, but no one arrived. Hours passed, and the silence became unbearable. Feeling a rising sense of dread, Sun decided to leave. A baffling disappearance. Sun drove away, glancing in his rearview mirror as the yurts disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he begin to relax. Shaken by the experience, he chose not to visit any more herding points on that trip. Instead, he stayed overnight at a familiar settlement and shared his story with the local herders. To his surprise, they were equally puzzled. They had lived in the grasslands for generations, but had never heard of such an incident. When Sun returned to the county, his first stop wasn't a wool trader. It was the local police station. He reported the strange disappearance of the herders, their livestock, and even their dogs. However, the officers dismissed his account, suggesting the herders had simply relocated and left their yurts behind for future use. Sun tried explaining that this wasn't normal, pointing out details like the loaded rifle and freshly washed clothes, but the police refused to investigate further. The following year, Sun returned to Bayan Bulak and tried to find the same herding point. Strangely, it was nowhere to be seen. Not only had the yurts vanished, but the lush grassland itself seemed to have disappeared, as if it had never existed. Lingering questions. To this day, Sun cannot forget that unsettling evening. Whenever he recounts the story, he is filled with a deep fear. They didn't just move, he insists. They vanished, completely disappeared. He remains haunted by the mystery of the missing herders, livestock, and the once lush grassland that seemed to dissolve into the vast, silent expanse of the Bayan Bulak grassland. The Tale of the Dragon. This is the story of a curious encounter on the perilous Xinjiang-Tibet Highway, a route infamous for its challenges and mysteries. To those familiar with the southern region of Xinjiang, the Xinjiang-Tibet Highway is a name that commands both respect and caution. Built early on, this road cuts through the towering Karakoram Range, a mountain range over 4,000 meters above sea level, known for its treacherous terrain and severe snowstorms. It leads to the remote Ali region in Tibet, an area renowned for its desolation and extreme climate. For most travelers, the Qinghai-Tibet Highway, a more accessible route with better facilities, is the preferred option for reaching Tibet. The Xinjiang-Tibet route, however, remains largely traversed by military vehicles, as it is known for its isolation and eerie tales. Among these tales is one shared by my childhood friend, Xiao Feng. A risky route. Xiao Feng is a bold man and a truck driver by trade. While many shy away from the Xinjiang-Tibet Highway due to its dangers, Xiao Feng sees it as an opportunity for efficiency. The detour through Qinghai adds significant costs in fuel, and he prides himself on his driving skills. For him, the direct route, despite its risks, was the logical choice. It was September of last year when Xiao Feng embarked on another trip along the Xinjiang-Tibet Highway. As always, he prepared meticulously. Any driver on this route knows the importance of carrying extra fuel, spare tires, and charms like auspicious symbols or decals to ward off misfortune. He also brought along a co-driver, Xiao Zhang, to alternate shifts and avoid fatigue, a critical safety measure on these unforgiving roads. Into the mountains. After 2 days of driving, the truck began its ascent through the Daban Pass, a high-altitude mountain pass. The air grew thinner, and the temperature dropped sharply as they climbed. By the third day, snow began to fall. A thick fog blanketed the road, making visibility poor. Xiao Feng, undeterred by the worsening conditions, took over the wheel from Xiao Zhang. Most drivers would have stopped to wait out the snow, but Xiao Feng, confident in his sturdy truck, pressed on slowly and cautiously. The road wound precariously along the mountain's edge, flanked by towering, ice-capped peaks. The scenery was breathtaking, but Xiao Feng had no time to admire it. One slip of the wheel could send the truck plummeting into the abyss below. Suddenly, a deafening rumble shattered the stillness. It was coming from the mountain above. Xiao Feng's heart sank. Avalanche! A terrifying phenomenon where massive amounts of snow, ice, and rock cascade down a mountain, often triggered by vibrations or weather changes. Xiao Feng stopped the truck. The rumbling grew louder, and his nerves frayed as he gripped the wheel tightly. Beside him, Xiao Zhang squeezed his eyes shut, his face pale with terror. Minutes felt like hours as they braced for impact, expecting the avalanche to engulf them at any moment. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise subsided. Cautiously, Xiao Feng opened his eyes and looked around. Miraculously, the road ahead was clear. The avalanche had struck a neighboring peak instead. Relieved, he stepped out of the truck to inspect the surroundings. The frozen giant. It was then that Xiao Feng noticed something peculiar. On the half-collapsed face of the adjacent mountain, a massive ice layer had been exposed. From within that ice, something strange and otherworldly emerged. A giant creature trapped in the ice. Even from 2 kilometers away, Xiao Feng could see the creature's form clearly. It resembled a colossal lizard, over 200 meters long, with 4 massive claws and a serpentine body. Its head was fused directly to its torso without a neck. But what sent shivers down Xiao Feng's spine were its eyes, which remained wide open, staring directly at him. The creature's gaze was so vivid and lifelike that even the unflappable Xiao Feng felt his courage waver. Beside him, Xiao Zhang stood frozen, staring in stunned silence. The mysterious beast was encased entirely in the ice, as if it had been trapped there for countless centuries. Its exposed form, unearthed by the avalanche, seemed eerily out of place. Xiao Feng's mind raced. Could this be a dragon? A mythical creature revered in Chinese culture as a symbol of power and protection? Though uneducated, Xiao Feng was certain he was witnessing something extraordinary. As he stood there marveling, a sudden fog began to roll in. The thick mist shrouded the mountain, obscuring the creature from view. When the fog lifted moments later, the beast was gone, hidden once more behind the veil of ice and snow. A fortunate journey. Though shaken, Xiao Feng and Xiao Zhang resumed their journey. Strangely, everything seemed to go unusually well after that encounter. The rest of the trip was smooth, the cargo sold out quickly, and they avoided police inspections for overloading, a rare stroke of luck on the Xinjiang-Tibet highway. Back home, Xiaofeng couldn't shake the memory of the giant creature. He even commissioned a woodcarver to create a statue of a dragon, which now sits in his home as a talisman. Before every trip, he makes it a point to bow before it, hoping for continued fortune and protection. Though Xiaofeng continues to drive the Xinjiang-Tibet highway, he has never seen the creature again. Yet the memory of that day lingers, a reminder of the mysteries hidden deep within the frozen mountains. This is Xiaofeng's story, an encounter with what may have been a dragon, a fleeting glimpse into the extraordinary amidst the harsh realities of the road. The Lonely Temple in the Deep Mountains. This story, set in the remote forests of Xinjiang, unfolds in 1972 and centers on Lao Zhou, the father of one of my classmates. It's a tale of mystery and unease in a secluded mountain temple. The hidden forests of Xinjiang. For those familiar with Xinjiang, it's easy to picture endless deserts and barren landscapes. However, certain regions, particularly in the mountains, are home to vast stretches of pristine forest, untouched natural woodland. One such area is the famous southern mountains of Urumqi, where today's story takes place. Back in the 1970s, logging was a thriving industry, and Lao Zhou worked as a truck driver at a remote logging site on the northern slope of the Tian Shan Mountains, a major mountain range in Central Asia, known for its rugged peaks and forested valleys. The camp was situated deep in the forest, far removed from human settlements. Its isolation offered an unusual respite from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, a tumultuous period in China's history. A rainy day's journey. As a seasoned driver, Lao Zhou's job was to transport logs from the mountains to the commune in the valley below. The task wasn't easy. The journey required navigating a narrow, winding mountain dirt road, a basic unpaved route often prone to erosion, and each trip took 2 grueling days. One summer day, Lao Zhou was tasked with delivering a particularly urgent load of timber to support the commune's construction efforts. Normally, several trucks would travel together for safety, but on this day, Lao Zhou was the only driver available. Confident in his skills and mindful of the urgency, he decided to make the trip alone. By midday, the weather had turned. A heavy rain began to fall, turning the already uneven dirt road into a treacherous, muddy path. Lao Zhou gripped the steering wheel tightly, inching forward. The rain grew heavier, obscuring the road with a thick gray mist. Stopping wasn't an option. The delay might invite criticism for hindering socialist progress, a charge no one wanted in those days. The mysterious fork in the road. After several hours of slow, careful driving, Lao Zhou noticed something strange. A fork in the road, a point where a single path splits into 2. He had traveled this route countless times over the years and knew it like the back of his hand, yet he had never seen a split in the road before. Puzzled but pressed for time, he decided to take the right-hand path, reasoning it must lead somewhere and trusting his instincts. As he drove, the road narrowed and became increasingly difficult to navigate. It didn't feel familiar, but the steep terrain made turning around impossible. With no choice but to continue, Lao Zhou pressed on, hoping to find a spot where he could reverse course. The hidden temple. An hour later, the dense forest began to thin, and through the trees, Lao Zhou glimpsed the corner of a structure. Curious and slightly uneasy, he slowed the truck. As he approached, the full form of a temple, a place of worship, often in traditional Chinese style, with ornate roofs and symbolic decorations, emerged from the shadows. It was an old temple nestled in the heart of the forest. Its yellow-tiled roof gleamed under the rain, and its architecture was intricate, suggesting it had once been an important place. Lao Zhou was stunned. He had worked in this area for years and had never heard of a temple here. Who built it? Who lived here? As he stared, a faint bell toll, a ringing sound typically associated with temples, echoed from within. Someone was there. Relieved at the chance to ask for directions, Lao Zhou parked the truck and climbed through the wet underbrush toward the temple. Inside, the temple was eerily quiet and dim. A large statue of the Buddha, A spiritual figure in Buddhism representing enlightenment loomed in the center, covered in dust, as if it had been abandoned for years. The wooden prayer drums, mats, and other objects were similarly untouched, their surfaces thick with grime. Yet the bell, Lao Zhou was sure he had heard it. He called out, "Is anyone here?" His voice echoed in the empty hall. No response. The oppressive silence and the temple's disrepair filled him with unease. He quickly turned to leave. Hash the bell that shouldn't exist. As Lao Zhou stepped outside, his uneasiness grew. The rain had lessened, but the air felt heavy with an inexplicable tension. Then suddenly, the bell tolled again, clear, sharp, and haunting. Lao Zhou froze. The sound shouldn't exist. He had just explored the temple and seen no bell. Who or what was ringing it? Fear gripped him. Without looking back, he scrambled down the slope, back to his truck. Climbing inside, he started the engine and sped away, desperate to leave the strange temple behind. A familiar road. As he drove, the rain stopped, and a thick mountain fog rolled in. Strangely, the road began to feel familiar again. Looking closely, Lao Zhou realized he had somehow returned to the original route he always took. There was no sign of the mysterious fork. How had he ended up back here? He couldn't explain it. Lao Zhou eventually reached the commune and delivered the timber on time. The officials even praised his timely work, but he couldn't shake the eerie encounter in the mountains. Lingering echoes. Years later, Lao Zhou still insists he occasionally hears the sound of the bell ringing in his ears. Though doctors attribute it to tinnitus, a medical condition causing ringing or buzzing in the ears, Lao Zhou is convinced it's the same bell from that lonely mountain temple, a sound that continues to haunt him to this day. This is Lao Zhou's story, a chilling reminder that in the remote and uncharted corners of the world, some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Thank you for listening to these 10 stories. I have many more fascinating tales to share with you here on this channel. Please subscribe to my channel, Spaz Backwood, to stay updated.